The presentation I gave last year on destroyers for the RAN started off by posing the question, what is a destroyer? Well, I think we can start this one off by posing the question, what on earth is a frigate? And before we delve into history, I think we ought to consider this a little bit. With nautical terms, Admiral W.H. Smith is a good place to start. His book, first published in 1867, lists some 14,000 nautical terms, and frigate is among them. Ignoring the use of the word for the membranous zoophyte, also known as the Portuguese man of war, we're informed that in the Royal Navy, a frigate is the next class of vessel to a ship of the line, formerly a light, nimble ship built for the purpose of sailing swiftly. For our purposes, that's not entirely helpful. Perhaps the Oxford English Dictionary could provide a more modern interpretation. It defines frigate as a war vessel. In the Royal Navy, formerly a vessel of the class next in size and equipment to ships of the line. Admiral Smith's definition survives today, but helpfully the OED adds, since 1943, a naval escort vessel, a large corvette. That will indeed be our starting point, although today the class of ship includes vessels larger than the light cruisers of World War II, which are equipped with weapons capable of destroying such a ship before the cruiser even realized that they'd been detected. One common feature of modern frigates is an anti-submarine role, however. As World War II approached, Britain had a need for a large number of inexpensive escorts for anti-submarine duties, which could be built in large numbers by shipbuilders not used to warship work. A corvette designed by Smith Stock, based on the whale catcher Southern Pride, was selected, and the first were ordered in 1939. The first were available in July and August 1940, and ultimately nearly 300 Flower-class corvettes were built in Britain and Canada. In Australia, a program was begun in 1938 to build small vessels for local defence. The design was largely completed by February 1939, and the first local defence vessel was ordered in December 1939 from Cockatoo Dockyard in Sydney. Other shipyards soon received orders, and the construction of these small ships helped rebuild the Australian shipbuilding industry, which had declined during the previous decade. They were reclassified as Australian minesweepers Bathurst class in 1940, not least because the Admiralty considered the designation local defence vessel confusing, and we mustn't, of course, confuse the Admiralty. Ultimately, 60 of these little ships, which became commonly known as corvettes, were built, including 20 to Admiralty account, although they were commissioned as RAN ships, and 4 for the Indian Navy. The British Flower-class corvettes earned their place in history, particularly in the North Atlantic. They were, however, rather too small for the demanding convoy work, being overcrowded, uncomfortable, and too slow for their anti-submarine duties. In November 1940, plans were considered for a larger and faster escort vessel, about 300 feet long, with much better seakeeping qualities. The speed of 22 knots was desirable, but would have required turbine propulsion when turbine production was dedicated to larger warships. Instead, 2 corvette engines were to be fitted, with a speed drop to about 20 knots. Whilst commercial construction practices were adopted as far as practicable, the new twin-screw corvette design was much more a warship than the Flower-class corvette. The 1,865-ton frigates were designed for riveted construction, although the design was later successfully adapted for welded construction in the 75 ships built in the United States between 1942 and 1945. The first orders for the new River-class frigates, or ships rather, I'll call them for the moment, were placed in February 1941. The designation twin-screw corvette was clumsy, and it was the Royal Canadian Navy which began to refer to its own ships of the class as frigates in March 1942. The change was met with resistance in Britain, with the First Sea Lord telling the Canadians, that there was insufficient justification for the use of the term frigate, and it is therefore intended that all ships of the class should be designated corvettes. Despite this resistance, on the 23rd of February 1943, the Admiralty reclassified the new ships as frigates, reviving a proud historic designation which continues today. In Australia, in April 1941, the then acting Prime Minister requested the Naval Board to consider options for a more capable warship for Australian trade defence. Prime Minister Menzies, then in England, sought advice from the Admiralty, and the River-class design was recommended. The Naval Board concurred and recommended that initial order be placed for 6 ships. On the 5th of July, the Director of Engineering, Naval, wrote to Cockatoo Dockyard advising that the tentative programme for shipbuilding for 1941-42 included the construction at Cockatoo of 2 twin-screw corvettes complete with engines, and asking that this work be borne in mind when planning the dockyard's work programme. RAN River-class frigates 1 and 2 were ordered from Cockatoo Dockyard on the 16th of August 1941. But it was not until the 8th of June that the company actually forwarded an approximate estimate of the cost of constructing the new corvette of £360,000. The ship actually cost £373,000, and whilst that doesn't sound like an awful lot of money to us today, in today's dollars, that's roughly $32 million. It's interesting also to compare the cost of building these ships in Australia. The most expensive was one out of State Dockyard, £440,000, and the least costly was the last one out of Morts at £313,000. Construction of the River-class frigates at Cockatoo was delayed by more urgent ship repair work, and the first of the class to complete was Gascoigne, frigate number 5, built by Mortstock in Balmain. Number 1 was laid down on the 21st of October 1942 and was named Barcoo, and launched on the 26th of August 1943. Reflecting war experience, several changes were incorporated into Barcoo during construction, and only 5 weeks before completion, the guns were changed, bulletproof shelters and protective bulwarks were removed to save top weight, and the mainmast was removed and replaced by a goalpost mast. She was completed and handed over on the 10th of February 1944. Changes made to frigate number 2, Barwon, were far more extensive and included improved armament, modified magazines, and changes to the bridge structure. The River-class frigate programme was ultimately increased to 22 ships, although only 12 were completed by Cockatoo, Mortstock, State Dockyard in Newcastle, Wargers in Maryborough, and the Williamstown Naval Dockyard. The first 8 ships were very similar to the many ships of the class built in Britain, Canada, and the United States. The final 14 were altered significantly to improve anti-aircraft capability. This was done by modifying the bridge structure to enable 2 twin 4-inch quick-firing gun mountings to be fitted together with 1 twin 40mm Bofors mounting and much improved fire control arrangements. The 4 ships completed to this modified River-class design, Condamine, Shalgoa, Murchison, and Shoalhaven, were propelled by the same machinery as the first 8 ships. More modified River-class frigates were ordered on the 10th of December 1942, but these were intended to be fitted with steam turbines. All were cancelled in 1943 to 44 as the war was being won at sea. With the war drawing to a conclusion, as the Australian River-class frigates were completed, many saw very little service. For example, after Barwon was commissioned, she carried out patrol duties in New Guinea before returning to Australia to pay off in March 1947, after only 14 months in commission. The modified River-class ships saw more service than most of the earlier ships in Japanese waters and Korea. Of the earlier ships, Barcoo, Gascoigne, and Diamantina saw further RAN service as survey ships, and Diamantina is today at the Queensland Maritime Museum possibly the last survivor of the class. Not sure about that. The river-class frigates had been designed as anti-submarine escorts. In the years after the war, the early RAN ships were modernized by the installation of squid anti-submarine mortars forward of the bridge. But like so many of their contemporary World War II conceived ships, they were hampered by their lack of speed, which limited their effectiveness against modern high-speed submarines. Many of the large numbers of frigates were decommissioned, sold for ongoing service with some 16 navies, or ultimately scrapped, although the Canadians completed an interesting modernization of 21 ships with the forecastle deck extended right aft, squid mortars in a well aft, and much improved crew accommodation. After the end of World War II, the commercial shipyards in Australia, which had been revived by the Naval program and the program for construction of commercial vessels, concentrated on the latter, and naval construction was concentrated at the two Commonwealth-owned yards, Cockatoo Dockyard in Sydney and the Williamstown Naval Dockyard in Victoria. The two yards had orders for the battle-class destroyers Anzac and Tobruk. In December 1946, the Commonwealth ordered 4 more destroyers of the British Daring class, 2 from each yard, all welded ships of advanced design, which were to introduce new construction practices to the yards. Whilst the RAN needed ships to maintain its destroyer force, government approval was given on the basis that the work would help to avoid the situation which had existed in 1939, when Australia barely had a shipbuilding industry. The construction of the destroyers would help establish a continuous program of naval construction and maintain the necessary skills. The construction of all these destroyers was ultimately delayed by several factors, not least being the restrictions on the rate of expenditure imposed by the Treasury in the financially difficult times. It's interesting that one of the intentions of this whole program was to maintain and establish and maintain a continuous program of naval construction. It sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? It's taken a while to come around back to the same philosophy. Dominating naval planning, RAN naval planning, in the early years after the war was the need to provide anti-submarine ships capable of dealing with the high-speed submarines which had been developed during the war. Existing frigates were too slow, and whilst destroyers would add considerable capability, and in 1950, the Navy recommended the modernization of 3 tribal-class destroyers, conversion of the 5 Q-class destroyers on loan from the RAN to fast anti-submarine frigates along the lines of an Admiralty design designated Type 15, and the construction of 6 anti-submarine frigates to follow the 6 destroyers already on order. The program was implemented, but the projected timescale and cost estimate was to prove wildly inaccurate. Ultimately, only 2 of the tribals were modernized, Arunta and Warramunga, but their pre-war design limited what could be achieved, and both ships only had a limited life. Bataan was not modernized. The frigate conversion and construction projects were much more effective, if protracted, and more costly than anticipated. In late 1938, the Admiralty had begun design studies for a new class of intermediate destroyer, which could be built in large numbers relatively quickly. Sketch designs were completed in May 1939, and the first flotilla of the emergency program destroyers, the O-class, was ordered on the 3rd of December 1939. Further orders followed, including the Q-class flotilla, which was ordered at the end of March 1940. The Admiralty proposed that 3 of the Q-class, Quiberon, Quickbatch and Quality, be manned by the RAN, but only the first 2 were commissioned as RAN ships on the 6th of July 1942. On the 4th of October 1945, the Australian War Cabinet approved an Admiralty proposal that 5 Q-class destroyers, including Quiberon and Queenborough, serving with the British Pacific Fleet, be transferred to the RAN on loan. The crews of the remaining 3 RN-manned Q-class destroyers, Quadrant, Queenborough, and Quality, were returned to the UK, and Quadrant was commissioned in October 1945 and paid off into reserve on the 20th of June 1947. Queenborough was commissioned in October 1945 and served until May 1946, when she joined the Reserve Fleet in Sydney. Quality was transferred in November 1945, but served as an RAN ship for only 59 days, paying off to reserve on the 25th of January 1946. Following the RAN's proposal in January 1950 to convert the 5 Q-class destroyers to anti-submarine frigates, in May 1950, Prime Minister Menzies sought British agreement for the conversions on the basis that Australia would pay the full cost, then estimated at £400,000 per ship. In response, the ships were given to Australia with all their stores, and they were permanently transferred on the 1st of June 1950. The conversion of the ships was to be shared between Cockatoo, Queenborough, Quiberon and Quality, and Williamstown, Quadrant and Quickmatch. At early meetings held at Navy Office in April 1950 and at Cockatoo in May 1950, despite a lack of information on the nature of the conversion, decisions were made about the sharing of the drawing office work between the 2 dockyards, with Cockatoo to prepare most of the working drawings for the structure and piping systems, and Williamstown preparing some of the drawings for structure forward of the machinery spaces and ventilation drawings. Navy Office was to prepare all drawings for weapon systems and spaces. When the extent of the structural work involved on the conversion became known around August 1950, it was also agreed that Cockatoo would provide a full set of loft templates for the new structure above the weather decks for Williamstown. As guidance for the conversion of the Australian ships, the Navy Office acquired the drawings of the prototype ships Rocket and Relentless, which had begun conversion in 1949 at Portsmouth and Devonport dockyards. The conversion of the Type 15 frigates was very extensive. All the superstructure was removed above the weather decks, and internal minor bulkheads were stripped. The forecastle deck was extended almost to the stern, with one of the biggest aluminium structures used in ship construction in Australia at that time. Forward of the funnel, a low bridge structure housing the operations room and electronic spaces was built on the forecastle deck, also in aluminium. In most of the British conversions, a small wheelhouse with windows was built above the forward end of this structure, with a small bridge above the operations room. This arrangement ultimately proved impractical, and the Australian ships were fitted with an enclosed bridge on O1 deck. The armament of the Australian ships was planned to include a twin 4-inch gun mounting forward on one deck, on number 1 deck aft rather, and a twin 40mm Bofors Mark V mounting on the forward superstructure, with the main armament being the 2 Mark X anti-submarine mortars in wells aft. Production difficulties with the Mark X mortar meant that the first of the RAN conversions, Quadrant, was completed with 2 squid mortars as an interim measure. HM ships Rocket and Relentless completed their conversions in 1951 and proved to be very successful. Ultimately, 23 Royal Navy destroyers were converted to Type 15 frigates. In Australia, the first ship to complete conversion was Quadrant at Williamstown. She had been taken in hand in January 1950, began her sea trials in April 1953, and was commissioned in July 1953. Queenborough and Quiberon were taken in hand in May 1950. In addition to the conversion work, the machinery in the ships was thoroughly overhauled, and in Queenborough, a gear wheel had to be removed from the starboard gearbox for machining of the trunnions, a fairly significant exercise. In addition to the new anti-submarine armament, the ships were fitted with new radar and communications, greatly improved accommodation, enlarged galley and laundry facilities, and extensive air conditioning. All of the ships were delayed by the need to adapt the British design to suit Australian requirements and delays in the supply of equipment. Work in the ships was stopped on occasions to allow the drawing officers in Navy Office, Williamstown and Cockatoo to catch up. At Cockatoo, progress was also hindered by a lack of skilled labour, particularly in the outfitting trades. Queenborough was handed back to the RAN on the 1st of December 1954 and commissioned on the 7th of December that year. Lack of labour and the workload on the construction of the Daring-class destroyers, Voyager and Vampire, meant that Cockatoo had few resources available for Quiberon. At the end of 1954, structurally virtually complete, she was moved to Garden Island with barge loads of equipment for completion by that dockyard. She was eventually completed and commissioned on the 18th of December 1957. Some material was purchased for the fifth ship, Quality, but she was never taken in hand, and her conversion was cancelled. She had been given short refits in reserve in 1948 and 1950, but by 1954 her structure was severely deteriorated and her hull was patched in places. In August 1956, she was seen to be taking water. Corroded through at the waterline, she was swiftly docked in the Captain Cook dock, and all her superstructure above the weather deck was cut off and scrapped to reduce her draft, and she was refloated to await her fate. She was finally sold in April 1958 and scrapped in Japan. Quadron served on for only 4 years, being decommissioned in August 1957. Quickmatch served from September 1955 to April 1963, Quiberon from December 1957 to June 1964. Queenborough served as an anti-submarine frigate for nearly 10 years before decommissioning in 1963, but she was recommissioned in July 1966 as a training ship, a role she continued until 1972, the last of the RAN Type 15 frigates. The third component of the Navy's plan to modernise and enlarge the RAN's anti-submarine force began when in August 1950, Cabinet approved the construction of 6 modern anti-submarine frigates at a total cost of £14 million. The ships took the place of further destroyers, which would otherwise have been necessary to maintain the continuity of naval construction at Cockatoo and Williamstown. For at that time it was still expected that all the Daring-class destroyers would be completed by the mid-1950s. The number of ships was reduced from the planned 6 to 4 in April 1953, when one of the Darings, Waterhen, was also cancelled, and the modernisation of Bataan and the conversion of Quality deferred indefinitely. The need for a new generation of anti-submarine ship with a speed of at least 25 knots emerged in Britain in 1944, and initially thoughts were for 2 of the new ships to be ordered as part of the 1945 programme. Constructor M.K. Purvis was given the task of developing the new design, which was initially based on a more powerful version of the Black Swan class sloop. Studies continued through 1945, with the parallel need for ships as specialised anti-submarine, anti-aircraft escorts and aircraft direction duties, directed work towards the concept of a common hull and machinery, which could be fitted out for the different roles. The high speed required by the anti-submarine version of the new frigate could only be achieved by using steam turbine machinery. As work continued after the end of the war, concern about the capacity of industry to produce sufficient turbines in an emergency meant that 2 types of ships were developed: a common hull powered by 8 ASR-1 diesel engines with a top speed of 23 knots and for anti-aircraft and aircraft direction duties, which became the Type 41 and Type 61 frigates, and a more powerful steam turbine-powered ship capable of 27 knots, which became the Type 12. As the rapid advances in weapons and electronics made these ships rather expensive, a cheaper single-screw anti-submarine frigate was also designed, which became the Type 14 utility frigate, intended to be capable of production in rapid numbers. These ships earned the unfortunate title of Type 14 futility frigates. The primary task of the Type 12 was the protection of convoys from submarine attack. Several versions of the design were considered before a ship 360 feet long and 41 feet in beam, design Y, powered by steam turbines developing 30,000 shaft horsepower, was chosen in February 1950. The machinery was of a new design known as Y100, which had been ordered for English Electric in 1948. Construction of the first ship had been authorised in the 1949 programme, and after Admiralty approval of the design in December 1950, the first ship was ordered in February 1951. The Type 12 frigate was to prove to be one of the most successful post-war warship designs, with several variants of the design developed and some 70 ships built for 7 navies over the following 3 decades. The original concept for the family of new frigate designs was for a range of ships which could be built rapidly and in large numbers, with parts prefabricated away from shipyards and brought together for assembly. Following post-war experiments with the modern all-welded ex-German destroyers, which proved the resistance to damage of a hull constructed with widely spaced frames and closely spaced longitudinals, this method of construction was adopted for the new frigates. The construction of the Type 41 and Type 61 frigates in this way proved difficult, and a slightly wider spacing of longitudinals was adopted for the Type 12. Nevertheless, the ships had 31 longitudinals, more forward, which were continuous through the tapered frames and bulkheads, compared to the 19 longitudinals in the Daring-class destroyers, presenting quite a challenge for the shipbuilders, although it proved effective in service. The outfit of the Type 12 was also more complex than any previous ships, and they were quite cramped. Despite plans for the electronic spaces to be constructed and fitted out away from the shipbuilders, this form of modular construction proved to be overly ambitious for the time, and construction of the Type 12 frigates was definitely a job for specialist warship builders, and they were quite expensive. This photograph shows the model of the Y100 installation in a Type 12 before the cruising turbines were removed. The hull form of the Type 12 was unusual. One of the requirements for the ship had been the ability to maintain high speed in rough conditions. This led to a very fine hull form forward. The 4.5-inch Mark 6 twin mounting forced the bridge well aft, and the turret was set as low as possible to provide visibility forward from the bridge. To provide sufficient freeboard forward and to keep the decks as dry as possible in rough conditions, the forecastle deck was raised, resulting in the distinctive Type 12 hump in the shear line. The extra space this hump provided in the hull enabled 2 diesel alternators to be positioned under the forecastle, well separated from the other machinery spaces. The Y100 steam plant was located well aft. Machinery comprised a cruising turbine and a main turbine with a reduction gearbox, supplied by 2 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers in a single boiler room. The cruising turbine was later removed. To reduce radiated noise, which would interfere with anti-submarine operations, the frigates were fitted with 5-bladed propellers of a new design, which were slow running at a designated 220 RPM at full power, compared with 300 RPM in the Daring-class destroyers. The propellers were fitted with an air injection system on the leading edge of the blades, the agouti system, to reduce cavitation noise. With 2 ahead-throwing mortars and comprehensive sonar installation, the Type 12s were formidable anti-submarine ships, and with their easily driven hull and high freeboard, they developed a reputation for outstanding seakeeping. The Royal Navy built 6 ships to the original design, the Whitby class. The lead ship of the class, Whitby, was commissioned on the 10th of July 1956. and one of the class, Scarborough, visited Australia in October 1958 to give the RAN and the shipbuilders some idea of what lay ahead. In 1955, the design was updated with a new deckhouse aft to accommodate the Seacat guided missile, which was then being developed, together with partial bunk sleeping in some messes and modified central messing. This became the Rothsey class, and 9 ships of this type were built for the RN. Some of the later ships were also partially air-conditioned, with self-contained air conditioning units. Now, preliminary information had been provided to the Australian builders in October 1950 based on Design Y. By the time the orders were placed for the first 4 ships, designated FSA, RAN and O1 and O2 at Cockatoo and O4 and O5 at Williamstown in February 1952, the design was substantially more advanced, and completion of the 4 Australian ships, was then planned for 1957. The delays to the Daring-class destroyers and the heavy workload in both dockyards meant that little progress was made with the frigates for some time, although the manufacture of the turbines and boilers at Cockatoo proceeded ahead of ship construction. At Cockatoo Island, work began in the mould loft on the 8th of May 1952, but the processing of steel for the hull for the first ship was not started until December 1955. She was launched as Parramatta by Lady Darling on 31st of January 1959. Contractor sea trials were carried out in December 1961, and Parramatta was handed over and commissioned on 4th of July 1961. Her sister ship Yarra was completed by Williamstown in Melbourne on the 27th of July 1961. The 4 RAN Type 12s are frequently referred to as Rothsey class. The first 2 ships bore a resemblance to that class, but during their construction, every opportunity was taken to modernise them to incorporate improvements in the class from Britain and unique Australian characteristics. All the necessary design work for these changes was done in Australia. Compared to the Rothsey class, Parramatta and Yarra had increased fuel and fresh water capacity, full air conditioning of all operation and accommodation spaces with a centralised plant, cafeteria messing, and bunk accommodation for all senior and junior sailors to RAN standards. In the machinery spaces, the cruising turbines were deleted, they were removed before completion, and a fully enclosed and air-conditioned machinery control room was fitted in the engine room, a feature that did not appear in the RN, the Royal Navy, until the later Leander-class improved Type 12. The armament was also different. Torpedo tubes were not fitted, they were removed before completion, and the MRS-3 gunfire control, also a Leander-class improvement, replaced the Mark 6 director. The British Type 277 radar was replaced by the Dutch HSA LWO2 on the top of a fully enclosed foremast, which certainly didn't help the ship's stability. And the ships were fitted with US source electronic warfare equipment and improved communications. Yarra and Parramatta were fitted for, but not with Seacat when they commissioned, and mounted a 40mm Bofors Mark 5 mounting until the missile system was fitted at a later date. The second Cockatoo-built ship, FSA RAN02, was laid down on the 20th of March 1959, and we could run a competition to see who can name the fine gentleman on the top left photograph. At the time, she was intended to be identical to Parramatta, but shortly before her launching by Mrs. J.G. Gorton, wife of the Minister for the Navy, on the 8th of April 1961, everything changed. In early 1961, the dockyards were advised that it was intended that the second 2 ships would be modified to accommodate the Australian-designed Ikara anti-submarine weapon system. We didn't call it Ikara in those days, it was quietly known as Missile A1. Ikara had been under development since the late 1950s as a cruise missile, which carried a homing torpedo for delivery close to the target at a maximum range of about 11 nautical miles. Ikara greatly extended the effective range of the anti-submarine warship and filled an important gap in capability until shipborne helicopters became available to the fleet. The installation of Ikara and Stuart and Derwent resulted in extensive changes to the ships. Space for the missile magazine and assembly room was created by removing one Mark 10 mortar, but other consequential changes resulted in most of the arrangement of the ship above number 2 deck, the upper deck, being altered. Hence, when Stuart was launched, everything above number 2 deck was in abeyance, pending the redesign. Both Stuart and Derwent were modified. Stuart was intended to be the trial ship for Ikara, and Derwent was to be the first RAN ship with Seacat. Both ships retrospectively received the missing systems. As the Ikara handling system was being developed, the fitting out of Stuart proceeded in a rather ad hoc manner. Amongst the changes was the fitting of a variable depth sonar, the Canadian AN SQS 504, which was installed on the quarterdeck. The electronic warfare installation was also modified. The Ikara handling system was hydraulic powered, with missiles slung under number 1 deck. Before firing the missiles, they were transferred through a bulkhead to the assembly area, where they were fitted with wings and fins before being transferred to the launcher on the quarterdeck. The limited space in the Type 12 meant that the handling system was mounted directly onto the ship's structure. It was necessary to align the handling system precisely, and the mounting surface had to be flat to within 4 thousandths of an inch over any 4 feet in any direction. As the modified structure for Stuart was installed after launching, the flat surface was achieved by fitting 360 individually machined pads to the deck and overhead structure. And I've got one, which is a bit tragic really, but I have memories of many long hours spent with a theodolite and an optical micrometer in Stuart's Ikara magazine, measuring each corner of the 360 pads. They were tack welded into position and then dressed by hand before the handling equipment was fitted. Alignment was usually undertaken at night when temperature-induced movement in the ship was at a minimum. In later ships, the overhead structure was prefabricated and machined before fitting at the ship, which greatly simplified the process. When we were doing this job, we rather doubted that the whole thing could possibly work, but it did. Contractor sea trials for Stuart were carried out in October 1962, and in early 1963, the first Ikara launcher was delivered to the island and fitted to the ship. In February-March Stuart went to sea again for a series of test firings of the missile. The installation of the handling equipment was not complete at that time, and when she was handed over to the RAN on the 27th of June 1963 and commissioned as the trial ship for Ikara. She returned to the dockyard on several occasions over the following year to complete that work and to fit other equipment not installed for her trials role. Whilst they entered service much later than originally intended, the Type 12 frigates came with an improved capability and served Australia well for many years. All 4 ships were modernised in the late 70s and 1980s, although the modernisation for Yarra, which was carried out at Cockatoo Island, was much reduced in scope, as her structure was the most Whitby-like of the 4 ships, and a shorter life was expected. She became the trial ship for the Australian-developed sonar Maloka. Parramatta, Stuart and Derwent were modernised at Williamstown in Victoria. Parramatta began her modernisation refit in June 1977 and was recommissioned in August 1981. The modernisations were protracted and expensive, a common experience for Type 12s. The remaining ships of the original 6 proposed, FSA, RAN 03 and 06, which had been dropped from the program in 1953, resurfaced in 1958. But in June 1964, they were finally approved. On the 23rd of June 1964, the Minister for the Navy, Mr. F.C. Cheney, announced that the 2 ships would be built by the dockyards at Williamstown and Cockatoo Island. The only yards outside Britain, he said, which had experience in building the Admiralty-designed Type 12 frigates. The intention was for the frigates, later reclassified destroyer escorts, becoming DE, RAN 03 and 06, was to be built in 4 years to replace Duchess, which the RN Royal Navy had lent to Australia to replace Voyager in 1968. Accordingly, they were intended to be identical to Stuart and Derwent, and the dockyards were asked to order all the material for the hulls immediately. I wish I had kept a copy of the order which was received by Cockatoo, because it reflected the urgency of the program. On a half foolscap page, the Department of the Navy purchase order was placed in accordance with the trading agreement for construction at cost. The order was described quite simply to build one only Type 12 anti-submarine frigate, generally similar to HMAS Stuart, as previously constructed by your company, and under the column labelled price it said TBA. As far as I'm aware, no contract for the ship was ever signed. By the time DE, RAN 03 and 06 were ordered, the design development of the Type 12 frigate had moved on considerably from the Rothsey class design on which Stuart and Derwent had been based. The Admiralty began development of the Rothsey class to produce a frigate of general purpose type in mid-1958. This new design became the very successful Leander class frigate. In the first 10 British Leander class frigates, the Y100 machinery was installed, but in the next 6, they had the modified Y136 power plant, and the last 10 had the Y160 machinery installation, which included the fully enclosed machinery control room that the RAN had adopted much earlier. The installed generating capacity was also progressively increased, and the last 10 ships had an extra 2 feet of beam to improve stability. Following a joint dockyard Navy technical mission to Britain in late 1964, the RAN decided to incorporate as many of the Leander class improvements as possible in 03 and 06, together with a range of other uniquely RAN changes. The revised general arrangement was issued to the shipbuilders in March 1965, and the ships were then effectively a new, purely Australian design. The extent of change was to a degree constrained by the already ordered material, so the narrow-beam Rothsey class hull was retained. Otherwise, apart from the armament, which remained the same as Stuart and Derwent, the ships were completely different. The forecastle deck was extended to the stern, increasing the ship's length to 372 feet. The variable depth sonar, which was not a success in RAN service, was dropped, and the Ikara launcher fitted in a well on the starboard quarter. The 4.5-inch Mark 6 gun mounting was updated from Mod 1 to Mod 3, and the MRS-3 fire control system was replaced by the Dutch M22, and the GWS-20 fire control for the Seacat was replaced with the Dutch M44. Internal and external communications and electronic warfare equipment were updated. Internally, the forward diesels were moved aft to the hold, and installed power increased. Heads and bathrooms were modernised, and crew accommodation improved as far as possible in the limited space available. A Leander-like superstructure was designed with a wider bridge for improved visibility aft. To reduce top weight, noting that we were still on a Rothsey hull, the superstructure above O1 deck, including masts and funnel, was constructed of welded aluminium, and internal minor bulkheads throughout the ship were also made of welded aluminium, with special extrusions being developed for the process. Machinery changes were extensive. Stabilizers were fitted, and generating capacity increased by 2/3. The Y136 machinery was adopted with some features of Y160, including automatic remote control of main and auxiliary machinery. Electric telegraphs, capstans, and steering control were also fitted. To incorporate all these changes, virtually a complete redesign of the ship was needed. a task shared by Navy Office, which set up an annex in Sydney to house extra staff, Cockatoo and Williamstown. The latter was designated as the lead yard. Construction of the ships continued to be a high priority, so design and construction continued in parallel, with, on occasions, drawings being prepared after work had been started at the ship. And indeed, some spaces were fitted out on the basis of photographs of the space in the other ship. And if you think that changes had stopped after the basic design was finished, the records show that between September 1966 and November 1968, there were a further 103 design changes. The turbines for both ships were made at Cockatoo as before. The boilers, which were of an improved design, were ordered from Britain to save time. Similarly, the gearing was ordered overseas. The anti-submarine mortars and handling equipment removed from Parramatta and Yarra when Ikara was fitted in those ships was refitted and modernised for 03 and 06. Consideration was given to modernising one spare turret to Mod 3, but in the end it was decided to be more economical and faster to order 2 new turrets from overseas. With political pressure for progress with the Voyager replacements, both ships were laid down on the 18th of August 1965, much too soon. Torrens was launched on the 28th of September 1968 by Dame Zara Holt, widow of the late Prime Minister Harold Holt. The lead ship Swan was commissioned at Williamstown in January 1970, although she was not actually completed until the 17th of April. The political imperative was still present. Torrens went to sea for contractor sea trials in May 1970 and was handed over on the 18th of January 1971. The 2 ships were completed years later than planned. In fact, the program extended by about 50%, and the project cost rose from an estimated 44 million to over 60 million by mid-1970. Now, in case you're not sure what that means in today's money, 60 million in those days is worth today about $831 million. However, despite the challenges and difficulties with the construction program, building 2 ships while you're actually designing them, which is not recommended, the 2 new RAN Type 12s were outstandingly successful and unique representatives of one of the most prolific post-war British warship designs. They were a tribute to the naval staff who decided to modernise the design, and the technical staffs in Navy Office and the dockyards who implemented the changes. It demonstrated a capability built up over many years of steady warship construction and gave confidence for the future development of a warship design capability in Australia, notably with the coming light destroyer DDL project to design and build 6 combat ships in Australia. Unfortunately, circumstances would lead in another direction. 2 more ships, DE RAN 07 and 08, were considered around 1970, but as most of the necessary equipment was no longer in production and the DDL was just around the corner, the idea was abandoned. Torrens and Swan served the RAN well for many years. Swan was decommissioned in September 1996 and sunk as a dive site on the 14th of December 1997 off the coast of Western Australia. Torrens was decommissioned on the 11th of September 1998 and was sunk in the Indian Ocean by a Mark 48 torpedo fired by the Collins-class submarine HMAS Farncombe on the 14th of June 1999. Torrens was to be the last Australian-built combat ship completed for the RAN for 21 years, until the guided missile frigate HMAS Melbourne, built at Williamstown in Victoria, was commissioned on the 15th of February 1992. But we don't have time to tell that story today. I think this is where we must stop.